having to do some maintenance work. Really, it comes down to, everything's working under normal operation. You can do, again, file shares across two different servers, whether it's a clustered server or not. It does, the shares basically are enabled via SMB. So in the SMB scale out, we have the full capability of increasing the density of your servers across multiple, or in a host. In terms of check disk, first failure recovery, those kinds of things. All of those are included in this particular piece. Using it's pretty simple. If you've installed Hyper-V on a 2012 server, you get now the new function to be able to just put your literally is nothing more than a UNC path. So all you need to do is type in where your VHD is on a file share, and that's really all there is to it. It's pretty slick. Important notes, Hyper-V supports SMB 3.0. Active Directory is required. One of the things that, from a System Center perspective, you will need to be using Virtual Machine Manager 2012 SP1. SP1 isn't beta right now. It should be out. I would think it's supposed to be out here fairly soon. Remote management, obviously through PowerShell and Server Manager, as well as Virtual Machine Manager. Again, a graphic here that really shows and illustrates sort of, how Hyper-V performs over SMB. Again, the idea with this picture really is to illustrate the idea that we're not having to utilize the higher functions of the operating system to make all of these features work, which then of course makes a whole lot less overhead in the system going forward. So it really does start to become pretty efficient. We get into some scenarios, a standalone particular, so we have two Hyper-V hosts. They're shared to a file server running a bunch of disk volumes. So there's no cluster involved here. It's just, independent Hyper-V hosts talking to a file share. Challenges, obviously, is the storage is not fault tolerant. The file server may not be continuously available, et cetera, but the idea being that, most businesses have some type of configuration like this. So you'll have some sort of file server, and you can connect your Hyper-V host to it. So it doesn't involve a lot of cost to put in. Then we talk about standalone. I mentioned storage spaces earlier. Like I said, storage spaces are really what I would call the Windows version of LUNs. So if you've got a JBOD array, direct attached array to a server, you may carve out a storage space that spans multiple disks. This is the same thing as a LUN, essentially, in a SAN. The idea being, of course, that the storage would then start becoming fault tolerant because it's spread across multiple disks. The VMs themselves may not be highly available, and whatnot, but at least your storage starts to become highly available. Then we get into the idea of the standalone file cluster or server with a clustered Hyper-V. So we now have a failover Hyper-V with the file server and storage spaces. Again, the idea here being that it's a different configuration, simply is still as valid, obviously makes things, you know, changes the scenario to some degree. You know, Hyper-Vs are highly available now. You know, still low acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, another flavor of how you could deploy this. Now we get to, again, another piece, clustered file server, standalone Hyper-V system. Again, so now the file server the file servers are clustered with storage spaces attached to a JBOD array. Again, still very valid, solves different problems, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get to the all clustered where, you know, now we have, you know, file server clustered, Hyper-V clustered, you know, we have high availability across the board, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get sort of the cluster in a box scenario where all the pieces are all kind of contained within the same hardware chassis. And the idea here was that the hardware and the OS and whatnot would be pre-configured by the OEM, so you could just go set it up and turn it on and have at it. Any questions on any of this stuff so far? So we'll talk about public and private cloud integration. So building your own cloud just got a lot easier with 2012, and I would absolutely agree that was the goal of this, and I would certainly concur with that statement. So considerations of cloud, scale up, mission critical. What kinds of applications, what kinds of services do you plan to run in the cloud? Storage, how do you plan on handling storage? Do you want to start off, you know, modestly, grow up into a more robust storage solution? You know, do you have security implications you need to think about? So those are all the things that kind of go into, you know, thinking about what your storage needs to be. Continuous availability. How available does it need to be? Obviously, if it's an email system or something mission critical line of business application, it probably needs to be up. VM mobility, you know, do I need my VMs to be able to move quickly and fault tolerantly? Networking, automation. So when they started thinking about mission critical workloads, you know, scale, obviously important, and it's not just virtual processors, it's the whole ball of wax. So you've got to scale disk, you've got to scale memory, utilization of memory, as well as the processors themselves. You know, you need to use all the hardware in the box, and you can, you know, if you're using, you know, some powerful host machines, you obviously want to be able to allocate those resources around to the different VMs that you want to be able to do. Live migration should just work. I don't know how many times I heard this talking to Microsoft people over the last year, that was just a big thing for them, is that it should just work. You know, performance must increase with cores. Obviously, the more processor cores we have, we want to make sure that we've got, you know, that you see, you know, that the end user sees a performance increase with that. And, you know, virtualizing workloads. And making sure that, you know, we can, you know, virtualized workloads considered non-virtualizable, which I liken this to things like SQL Server. Because I don't know how many times I hear, well, you shouldn't really virtualize SQL Server. And I'm like, well, you know, I don't buy that in all circumstances. I mean, you can easily virtualize SQL Server in probably probably, 70% of its uses. There's only very few applications that are probably custom written where virtualization, that 2% overhead that you pay for virtualization will actually hinder the performance of your system. One of the things, and I included this slide here because I think it's interesting, and a kind of a NUMA is non-uniform memory access, which is computer science speak for basically, how do I allocate processor and memory resources in hardware across software. And the idea is that, it really does start to take a concept from way, way back in the days of the mainframe guys, where they would have, regions within the mainframe, processor regions and memory regions and all this other stuff, and things were allocated by region. And mainframes were before my time, but I remember talking to some of these guys and how the hardware was allocated across the operating system and the code that they were executing on those particular machines. And that's really what this starts to do, is it starts looking at the hardware itself and allocating it into blocks that can be, uniformly, parsed out to, so that the VMs themselves, it's another layer of indirection, essentially. And it really is designed to make sure that you're allocating all the resources uniformly across your host machine. Hyper-V, looking at the sort of comparison chart, obviously, we look at 2008, 2008 R2, September 2012, you can see this, again, this, leapfrog support in terms of, the number of VMs and whatnot, and the amount of memory and whatnot that can be done between these different versions. I think it's awesome. It's again, very, very impressive. So this was the little screenshot from the TechEd thing that they did, and there's 32 virtual processors, and they're running, I think they're running like some SQL Server application or something like that, and so it really, then you start looking, then they scale it up again to 64 virtual processors and a terabyte of memory and whatnot, and you start to see, wow, this thing's just going like massive, I think they're running SQL 2012, so you can actually look at expensive queries and how they're executing across processors and whatnot. So, for the ridiculous geek in all of us. So again, high performance storage, live migration, virtual fiber channel. So you load Hyper-V 3.0, you'll see a virtual fiber channel option versus just virtual network only. There's new disk format VHDX, which is important for the live migration failover piece. Live VHD merge, which is really nice because now you can actually do that without having to shut the VM down. NIC teaming is built into it, which is awesome. We didn't have NIC, every time, prior to this, if you wanted to do NIC teaming, you had to do it with the drivers from the vendor, which sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Now it's built in natively. Obviously, clustering, concurrent live storage, whatnot, and then being able to do failover and whatnot. So we get the complete redundancy in a box, everything everything from the bottom up. We have hardware failover, live migration, application failover, and then DR. Hyper-V server. So this is the freebie, Microsoft's free Hyper-V server that basically it's kind of like I think it's ESXi 5.0 free one that you can get from VMware. You can get the same thing. This is the Hyper-V server from Microsoft. The big caveat here, of course, is the fact that you know, if you look at the comparison chart, you know, between the 2008 R2 SP1 version of this versus 2012, you can see obviously that it is actually available now. So this coming soon it's actually available now. I just saw it on TechNet. My subscriber login yesterday had this available, so you could download it. The big thing with this is that it's if you compare it to the free version from VMware, VMware limits you. No enterprise features. Microsoft gives you about as much as you could possibly want in the free version. So, as a personal aside, in my personal opinion, it's things like this that's going to make Microsoft basically undermine VMware all over the place. They will do what they're going to do to VMware what they did to Novell and NDS. If people who are really old school, you know, Novell Netware Directory Service was a pretty decent directory service, but Novell insisted on charging for it and limiting people to, you know, having to run NetWare, and, you know, Microsoft gave away Active Directory and nobody's using NetWare anymore. So this is the same thing. I mean, they're basically making a full Hyper-V server available to, you know, anybody that wants to download it. So with all the enterprise features included. System Center 2012. So we can't talk about Server 2012 without talking about System Center 2012 because they are really, really intertwined. For those that don't know, I mean, System Center 2012 is Microsoft's suite of management tools and products. So everything from, you know, System Center Operations Manager, Configuration Manager, Orchestrator, Service Manager, and Virtual Machine Manager are all tools to help you automate and optimize your IT environment. One of the things that Microsoft is pushing across their products, and frankly is something that, you know, again, the service consumer, I talked about service consumer earlier, they're the application owner. One of the things they're pushing a lot is self-service portal. So users start becoming more used to the idea of requesting things through a self-service portal, whether that's Service Manager or any other, you know, portal tool, maybe like a SharePoint site or something like that. The idea, though, is that users become more empowered, they become more independent, and, you know, the service, the data center, the service provider, you know, makes these services available via the System Center suite. As I have talked about with several, you know, over the past several months, this is sort of the coming wave. Whether it happens, you know, it's going to happen within the next few years, where, you know, process automation is key. It's the only way that we can scale in IT, and so you will see a lot of this. Orchestration, IT process automation, all these things will just basically become more and more automated as we go along. So what happens then is the service providers, those of us in IT that are on the back end, building services, can now be basically, you know, unhinged from having to do the mundane daily tasks, but can now work on what I would consider business-focused, business value, IT value to the actual service consumer, and that's, you know, all of this ecosystem is kind of really built around that. And so you'll see, obviously, and Windows Server is obviously a big part of that. It's a key cornerstone to that. SP1, like I said, SP1 for System Center 2012 is in beta. It should be out very soon. It is required for managing, if you want to manage Server 2012 hosts from Virtual Machine Manager, you need to run SP1. As well as if you want to deploy Windows 8 clients through Config Manager, you are also required to use SP1. If you have in-house developers, development operations, this becomes also a massive uplift in terms of functionality with SP1. Operations Manager is tied to Visual Studio, and Microsoft is also then including a new tool called the Global Service Monitor, which allows you to real-time monitor services that you have in your environment. And then, obviously, using SCOM, you can then go and monitor your production applications, and people can go and take a look at it. I think this is extremely cool. And there's kind of what the Global Service Monitor looks like. So what you really are creating is a external test hardware to be able to you know, test your applications and then report those results back. App Controller is a System Center 2012 application. It really is designed to bridge the gap between private clouds and public clouds so that your service consumers, your enterprise customers, don't see the difference. As far as they're concerned, it is cloud space, it is cloud capacity, but they don't care or have no need to know where that particular capacity comes from. Multi-tenancy, this was also a very big piece of Server 2012. This is the idea that you can create virtual spaces segregated off by you know, tenants or groups or whatnot. This becomes really important for things like PCI, other security things where you can't have, you know, data from one group potentially interfering with, you know, network traffic, you know, they have to be segregated off. And so the idea with the multi-tenancy piece is that it's all isolation boundaries, which I had a customer that I was talking to last week that asked me about this particular thing because they need to be able to create, you know, tenants for their PCI applications, and everything has to be completely segregated. Chargeback, this is important, obviously. You know, if you're in a situation, this is using Virtual Machine Manager and Service Manager as well. But the idea being that you would charge back business units for cloud space and server space and things like that. So, you know, if your business runs on a chargeback model, this would be one way to do that. Azure. So App Controller, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, the idea that you can move VMs between your on-premise, you can manage them in Azure using App Controller. Orchestrator, you can Orchestrator is a System Center tool that does process automation. So you have an Azure integration pack which ties that piece together and basically allows you to automate things in the Azure cloud. And then you have an Azure management pack that allows you to manage this is all SP1 stuff. Backup enhancements, Data Protection Manager is a System Center tool, and obviously in starting in SP1 you'll be able to back up your DPM images and whatnot to the cloud. And then here's a fun, hey, here's all the features of SP1, which there are a lot, awful lot. Important release for System Center 2012, extremely important. And then basically, here's some infrastructure enhancements. This is specific to VMM. As you can see, obviously it's built, VMM gets severe, it gets pretty upgraded across the board. Okay, so we have any questions about any of this stuff? Before we go into licensing, we got one quick license overview slide. Yes, sir.
Can you elaborate a bit about the app controller?
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more about it?
Well, so the idea of the app controller is it's a tool. It's an application you install, and it runs on web services, and so it connects to your virtual machine manager internal. So basically, it can consume what your private cloud looks like. So Virtual Machine Manager can give you the full view of your cloud. So you have virtual machines, you have virtual networks, you have storage, and all those things go into kind of what your cloud is, right? So you've got capacity in that cloud, you've got, particular elements that make up that fabric. So App Controller connects to that piece, and at the same time it can connect to like Azure. So it basically gives you then view of what your public cloud tenant looks like. So again, from the end user's perspective, and there's a portal that you would install, the service consumer can then go out, you can say, I'm making, here's all the capacity that we have for cloud space. The user goes out to the portal and can request it and say, I need, cloud space, for a development team because we want to test an application, or we want to put an application out for beta, consumer review or something like that. So they would go out to the app controller and basically request that space.
I'm interested to see if does it manage data movement between private and public cloud?
It manages the movement of the infrastructure. So if you're trying to move the data, so let's say you've got a SQL database, you're trying to move that kind of data, it does not do that. It moves and manages the infrastructure. So you could say, okay, I want to move a VM from on-premise to the cloud, public cloud, and back again. Yeah, it does that just fine. But if you're trying to move like from SQL on-premise to say SQL Azure, that it doesn't do. That's where SQL 2012 has the internals to be able to do that type of data movement for you without having to.
That's what the vMotion is, isn't it?
Yeah, well, vMotion, again, vMotion's the VMware version of what's called live migration in Hyper-V. And that's the movement of VMs between physical hosts. And that's different than App Controller. So App Controller really is kind of taking it one step higher and looking at your cloud space as a completely virtualized, it's like a big bubble of capacity across what you have on premise, which would be private cloud, and what you have, in your public cloud, your Azure space. And so, a user goes in and says, well, I need some space, and I want to provision it. And you use App Controller to do that, whether it's public or private, or some combination thereof. Does that make sense? It's one of those things where it starts to get really heady in terms of a topic, because you're like, okay, mean, it starts becoming virtualization upon virtualization upon virtualization, to the point where you're kind of like, okay, where does this all live and how does it work and whatnot. So, yeah, vMotion and those kinds of technologies are down more around just high availability of, actual VMs across physical hosts. So, from a licensing standpoint, is there any other questions? I mean, I only have one slide here to talk about this, but this particular, so licensing changes significantly. You've got standard version and data center, and the only distinction between this, if you look at the graphic, has more to do with how you're virtualizing. So, data center can be 2 processors, n number of VMs. Standard is 2 processors, 2 VMs, and it's really just virtualization rights. That's the only difference between these two. Server enterprise is being retired, and the pricing shifts a little bit. But from the standpoint of your CALs and whatnot, you can see how they kind of translate into the new licensing model. It's slimmed down. It also matches up exactly with how System Center is being licensed. System Center is licensed exactly the same way. There's standard and data center, and the only difference between the two is how much virtualization you plan to do. And that's it. So, that's the end of the presentation. I should go look at I'm going to look at the chat room here and see what questions there are. Let's see. People are still in the chat room. Oh, there's several people. All right, so if you guys are in the chat room and you got questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat window, and I'll do my best to answer them. Same thing with everybody out in the audience. If you've got questions, let me know. I can't stress enough, if you've got some lab space, get Server 2012 up and running. It's a big, it's a big deal. It really is. Well, let's see. Don't have any questions in the chat room yet. Any questions left out here? Going once, twice. Okay.
Thanks, Fred.
All right. Thank you. You bet.
Thank you.